He was Julian Thorne, the titan of Silicon Valley, a billionaire who had pivoted from creating code to curating history. His public persona was that of a modern-day Medici, a gentleman explorer who rescued lost artifacts for humanity. She was a waitress, practically a ghost in the gilded machine of his world, her name a forgotten scribble on a weekly schedule. When he, with the casual cruelty of the monumentally rich, challenged her to interpret a priceless map to entertain his guests, he expected the flustered silence of the working class. He expected a blush, a stammer, a retreat. He had made a catastrophic error. He never imagined that the quiet girl pouring his $5,000 bottle of wine wasn't just another pretty face. She was the sole living heir to a secret that could vaporize his billion-dollar reputation and expose the fraudulent foundation of his entire empire. Ethelgard's table was less a restaurant and more a temple dedicated to the worship of money and power. Perched 70 floors above Manhattan, its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the city lights, a glittering carpet laid at the feet of its patrons. The air was thick with the scent of truffle oil, vintage leather, and an unspoken, suffocating arrogance. The walls were not adorned with art, but with artifacts. A cuneiform tablet under museum-grade glass, a 16th-century astrolabe gleaming under a spotlight, a samurai sword that had supposedly tasted blood in the Battle of Sekigahara. It was a curated display of conquest, and Julian Thorne was its high priest. And then there was Ilara. To the titans of industry and their surgically perfected wives, Ilara Vance was an extension of the cutlery. She was the 22-year-old waitress with the haunted grey eyes and a single, tightly wound braid that fell down her back. She was the one who anticipated the need for a fresh napkin before it was requested, who could carry 4 plates on one arm without a tremor, who memorized the esoteric dietary restrictions of a dozen people without a notepad. Her movements were a study in quiet efficiency, a ballet of self-effacement. She never spoke unless spoken to. In the ecosystem of Ethelgars, she was the perfect invisible servant. Her manager, a perpetually stressed man named Antoine, who wore his French accent like a suit of armor, praised her for her silence. She understands the atmosphere, he'd tell the other staff. She does not exist. That is the highest form of service. But beneath the starched black uniform and the practiced invisibility, Ilara Vance was drowning. 6 years ago, she hadn't been serving canapes. She had been cataloguing history. She was the last in a line of Vances who had owned and operated Vance Antiquarian Maps and Tomes, a dusty, magical 3-story haven in Boston that had been the secret heart of the historical cartography world for over a century. It wasn't just a shop, it was an institution. Her father had taught her to read the world not through words, but through lines, symbols, and the subtle watermarks on hand-laid paper. She could tell a 17th-century Dutch forgery by the chemical composition of its ink. She could trace the path of Magellan not by the lines on the map, but by the pattern of foxing on the vellum. She understood that a map wasn't just a guide from A to B. It was a story, a confession, a political statement, a prayer. But that life had been reduced to ash. A fire, declared accidental, but whispered to be arson by a rival developer, had consumed it all. It took the shop, it took her father, and it took her future, leaving her an orphan with a mountain of debt and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. So she served gold-leafed desserts to men who mispronounced Versailles, and she listened. She listened to them boast about their acquisitions, butcher the history of the art on the walls, and debate the merits of ancient civilizations based on a documentary they'd watched on their private jet. She was clearing a half-eaten plate of Wagyu beef when the restaurant's low hum of conversation shifted. sharpening into a current of focused energy. Antoine was practically genuflecting at the host stand. Julian Thorne had arrived. Ilara's breath caught in her chest. She didn't need to see his face, only his voice, a smooth, deep baritone cultivated for boardroom takeovers and TED Talks that sliced through the ambient noise. "Alistair, my friend, I trust you found the place without resorting to one of your dusty old charts?" Julian Thorne was more than a billionaire. He was a brand. He was ruggedly handsome in a way that seemed genetically engineered, with salt and pepper hair, a jawline that could cut glass, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He was always dressed in bespoke suits that managed to look both formal and adventurous, as if he'd just stepped off his yacht after closing a $10 billion deal. His public image was that of a scholar adventurer, a man who funded his own archaeological digs and used his immense wealth to liberate history from dusty museums and bring it to the people. Ilara knew exactly who he was, and she knew, with the cold certainty of a true expert, that he was a charlatan of the highest order. She'd seen the televised special on his discovery of a Roman shipwreck, cringing as he'd identified a common amphora as a one-of-a-kind ceremonial vessel. He was a historical tourist, a man who collected artifacts the way other men collected sports cars, valuing them only for their price tag and the story he could spin around them. He wasn't a scholar. He was a predator with a fantastic PR team. "Your table is ready, Mr. Thorne," Antoine murmured, bowing slightly. Of course, it was in her section, the best table, the one in the corner that offered both privacy and a panoramic view of the city's sparkling spine. Ilara kept her eyes down, her tray held perfectly level. She could feel the gravitational pull of his ego from across the room. He was hosting two guests. One was a young, sycophantic journalist from a major financial magazine. The other was Dr. Alistair Finch, a man in his late 70s, the polar opposite of Thorne. Dr. Finch was a legend in the world of historical academia, a true scholar with rumpled tweed jackets, ink-stained fingers, and a reputation for intellectual ferocity. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, like a desert tortoise dropped into a shark tank. "The problem with modern academia, Alistair," Thorne was booming as Ilara approached, "is its timidity. You're all content to shuffle papers in archives. I believe in active history, in touching it, owning it, feeling its power." Dr. Finch merely grunted, peering at the wine list through his thick spectacles as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Some of us believe its power is in its context, Julian, not its price tag." Ilara approached the table, her presence as subtle as a change in air pressure. "Good evening. May I offer you something to drink while you consider the menu?" Thorne didn't even glance at her. He made a flicking gesture with his hand, a dismissal aimed at the universe. "The 82 Petrus and water." Still, for the next hour she was a satellite in their orbit, refilling glasses, delivering courses that cost more than her monthly rent, and listening to Julian Thorne's symphony of self-aggrandizement. He pontificated about his latest acquisition, a Mayan codex he'd saved from a private collector in Zurich. He casually corrected Dr. Finch on the logistical challenges of crossing the Alps, citing his own experience helicopter skiing there. He was charming, brilliant, and utterly repulsive. And with every perfectly articulated boast, Ilara felt the ghost of her father's dusty shop, the scent of old paper and binding glue rising up to choke her. The sheer, crushing injustice of it all, that this performer was hailed as a savior of history, while she, who had lived and breathed its truth, was serving him bread. The main courses were cleared. The journalist was scribbling furiously, completely captivated. The moment Ilara knew was at hand. This was the real purpose of the dinner. It was time for Thorne's grand performance. "Now," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as he leaned forward. The table instinctively mirrored him. "For the real reason I dragged you all the way up here." He signaled to a man in a dark suit, standing discreetly by the entrance. The man approached with a carbon fiber briefcase, opened it on a nearby stand, and presented Thorne with a long cylindrical tube. With the flair of a master showman, Thorne unscrewed the cap and carefully, reverently, unrolled an object onto the white linen tablecloth. It wasn't paper or parchment. It was a single large piece of what looked like cured hide, a deep ochre in color, covered in a complex web of lines and symbols drawn in black and red ink. It was clearly ancient, the edges frayed, the surface scarred by time. "Gentlemen," Thorne announced, his voice resonating with theatrical awe, "I give you the Vinland map, the real one." The journalist gasped. Even Dr. Finch, the stoic academic, leaned in, his eyes widening in shock. The Vinland map was one of history's most famous and contentious artifacts, a supposed 15th century map depicting the North American coast, proof of Viking exploration centuries before Columbus. The known version had been proven a clever 20th century forgery. "This," Thorne said, tapping a manicured finger on the surface, "was acquired through a very private source in Scandinavia, carbon dated to 1050 AD, plus or minus 20 years. It predates the forgery by centuries. This, Alistair, is the map that rewrites the history of the New World." He put on a pair of sleek, rimless glasses, positioning the artifact under the table's pinned spotlight. He was in his element. "Look at the symbols," he murmured, tracing a path with his finger. "Classic Norse runes, but with a fascinating local variation. Here, the wolf, symbolizing a treacherous passage. Here, the serpent, for a winding river. It's a coastal chart, a guide for future expeditions. It details safe harbors, sources of fresh water, a simple, practical mariner's tool." He was squinting, clearly bluffing his way through the more complex iconography, picking out the symbols that looked vaguely familiar and weaving a plausible, if simplistic, narrative around them. It's crude, of course. The cartography is primitive, but its authenticity is undeniable. Elara was standing just to his right, a crystal pitcher of ice water in her hand. She hadn't meant to look. It was a cardinal sin of her profession to show any interest, to be anything other than a silent functionary. But she had seen the symbols, and her world, which had been grey and silent for 6 years, suddenly exploded into silent, screaming colour. Thorne, sensing her stillness, looked up. His eyes, sharp and predatory, met hers. He saw her gaze fixed on the map. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. This was a gift, an unexpected prop to demonstrate the vast, unbridgeable chasm between himself and the common masses. "Well, hello," he purred, his voice dripping with condescension. The table turned to look at her. Elara was frozen, trapped in a spotlight of mortification. "Don't be shy, my dear. Are you a history buff?" Antoine, from across the room, made a frantic, slicing gesture at his own throat, signaling for her to disappear. But Thorne held up a hand, stopping him. No, Antoine, it's quite all right. I'm a populist, after all. History belongs to everyone." He turned his full, high-voltage charm on her. "You seem captivated. What's your name?" "Elara," she whispered, her voice sounding like a rustle of dry leaves. "Elara. Beautiful." He gestured magnanimously at the priceless artifact. "Tell me, Elara, what do you see? Little pictures of boats and dragons?" He chuckled, sharing the joke with his guests. The journalist snickered. Dr. Finch looked down at his plate, a faint flush of embarrassment on his cheeks at his host's boorishness. Julian Thorne leaned back in his chair, his eyes glittering with amused contempt. "Go on," he said, his voice a silken command. "Impress us. Tell us what this old Viking sailor was trying to say." Ilara didn't move. The world around her dissolved. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of the city below, the oppressive weight of the room, it all vanished. There was only the map. It wasn't Norse. The thought was so immediate, so absolute, it was like a physical blow. The symbols weren't runes, they were pictograms, but of a kind she had only ever seen in one place, in the faded, leather-bound notebooks of her great-grandfather, a man who had been obsessed with a fringe theory about a pre-Incan civilization in the Amazon, a culture the academic world dismissed as myth. He called them the Sky Weavers. She knew the specific cross-hatching used to denote a mountain. She knew the double spiral that didn't mean a river, but a celestial cycle. She knew the ink wasn't iron gall, as a Viking would have used. She could almost smell it, the acrid, earthy scent of cochineal for the red and the unmistakable, deep matte of carbon black from burnt agave. This wasn't a mariner's chart from Scandinavia. This was a sacred text from a world that wasn't supposed to exist. This wasn't an artifact to Ilara. This was her family's secret, heartbreaking legacy, spread out on a table as a billionaire's plaything. Julian Thorne was still smiling his predatory smile. "Speechless? I understand. It's a lot to take in." A cold, clear rage, pure and hard as diamond, suddenly solidified in Ilara's chest. The years of grief, of humiliation, of forced silence, fused into a single, unbending point of focus. She didn't reach out. She didn't touch the map. She simply spoke. Her voice, when it came, was not the whisper of a waitress. It was the clear, incisive, academic tone of her father. It was the voice of Ilara Vance, of Vance Antiquarian Maps and Tomes. "He wasn't a Viking," she said. The table went still. Thorne's smile faltered. "I beg your pardon?" Ilara's eyes scanned the map, her mind processing the symbols at a speed Thorne, with his dilettante's knowledge, could not even fathom. She wasn't just seeing pictures. She was reading a language. She understood the syntax, the grammar of the images, the unwritten cultural context that gave them meaning. "He wasn't a Viking," she repeated, her gaze finally lifting to meet Thorne's. "And this isn't a map of the North American coast." The journalist Sarah put her pen down. Dr. Finch looked up, his expression shifting from embarrassment to sharp, academic curiosity. "That's absurd," Thorne snapped, his charm vanishing, replaced by a flash of irritation. "The provenance is impeccable. The carbon dating tells you the age of the hide it's drawn on, not the age of the ink," Ilara stated calmly. "This isn't vellum. It's cured jaguar hide, a material used for sacred documents by several pre-Columbian Mesoamerican cultures. The Vikings used calf skin." She pointed a single steady finger at a cluster of symbols. "You identified this as a wolf for a treacherous passage. It's not a wolf. It's a jaguar, a sacred animal. And the symbol below it isn't a wave. It's the glyph for a solar eclipse. He's not warning of bad water. He's recording a celestial event." Thorne's face had gone from tan to a sickly pale. This wasn't a lucky guess. This was a systematic, brutal demolition. "And this," she continued, her voice gaining strength as the years of suppressed knowledge flooded back, "where you see a serpent for a river. You're missing the context. That's the glyph for Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. But when it's drawn next to this glyph," she indicated a small, complex circle, "it doesn't represent a god or a place. It represents a dynasty, a bloodline." "A bloodline," Dr. Finch whispered, now leaning so far over the table he nearly knocked over his water glass. "Yes," Ilara said, her focus entirely on the map. "This isn't a map of a place. It's a map of time. It's a dynastic chart, a record of a royal lineage. Each of these major symbols isn't a landmark. It's a ruler, and the lines connecting them aren't rivers or roads. They're lines of succession." She looked directly at Thorn, her grey eyes no longer haunted, but blazing. "You've translated this passage as safe harbour, fresh water. You're reading it like a child's picture book. What it actually says is, in the year of the Black Sun, the fourth king of the Serpent dynasty died, and his power passed to his sister, the Moon Jaguar." Silence, a profound, ringing silence that seemed to suck all the air out of the 71st floor. The city lights outside seemed to dim. The journalist was staring, her mouth agape. Dr. Finch looked as if he'd just seen a ghost. And Julian Thorne, he looked like a man who had just watched his entire fortune evaporate. He looked small, violated, and utterly, incandescently furious. Ilara took a half step back, the waitress persona settling back over her like a shroud. The black ink is a carbon-based pigment, likely from burnt agave. "It's extremely fragile and susceptible to flaking," she said, her voice quiet again. "The way you unrolled it, under the heat of that lamp, you've probably already caused irreparable damage. It needs to be stabilized in a humidity-controlled environment immediately." She looked at Julian Thorne. Her eyes held no triumph, no anger, only a vast, empty pity. "He's not telling you where to sail, Mr. Thorne," she said. "He's telling you a story you don't have the language to understand." She picked up her crystal water pitcher, turned with practiced grace, and walked away, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. The entire table watched her go, but she was only aware of one pair of eyes, the astonished, piercing blue gaze of Dr. Alistair Finch. Thorne was beet red, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the priceless, misunderstood map. "Well," he sputtered, trying to force a laugh that came out as a strangled bark. It seems our waitress has quite the imagination. A very creative interpretation." But no one was listening. Dr. Finch was staring at Ilara's retreating back, a single, world-altering question echoing in his mind. Who in God's name was that girl? The kitchen of Ethelgard's table was a blast furnace of controlled chaos. Where the dining room was a sanctuary of hushed tones and dim lighting, the kitchen was a stainless steel cavern of roaring flames, clattering pans, and chefs shouting orders in a rapid-fire mix of Spanish and French. Ilara pushed through the swinging doors, her hands shaking so violently she had to set the pitcher down on a prep counter with a loud clatter. She leaned against the cool metal, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Ilara, you okay?" asked Javier, the head saucier, without looking up from his copper pot. "You look like you just saw a tax auditor." "I'm fine," she breathed, squeezing her eyes shut. What did I do? What did I just do? She had shattered her one inviolable rule. Be invisible. After 6 years of carefully constructed silence, she had spoken up. She had shown off. And she had done it to one of the most powerful men in the city. The door swung open again, this time with a violent bang. It wasn't a chef. It was Antoine, his face a mottled red mask of pure panic. "Vance," he hissed, using her last name for the first time in the year she'd worked there. "My office." Now. His office was a glorified closet, crammed with wine inventories and scheduling charts. He didn't offer her a seat. "What, in the name of all that is holy, did you think you were doing?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a rage so profound it was almost silent. "He asked me a question," she said, her own voice barely audible. He is Julian Thorne. He is not asking you anything. He is making noise with his mouth. You are here to pour wine, remove crumbs, and be silent. You are not here to give a goddamn history lecture." "He was wrong," Elara said, a spark of defiance cutting through her fear. "I don't care if he said the moon was made of brie," Antoine shrieked, his composure finally snapping. "He is Julian Thorne. His patronage keeps this restaurant afloat. You do not correct him. You do not embarrass him. Do you have any concept of the position you have put me in? He is furious. He's demanding you be fired on the spot." Elara's stomach plummeted. Of course, she had publicly stripped him of his authority, his expertise. A man like Thorne wouldn't tolerate that. He would simply erase the source of his humiliation. I'm sorry, Antoine. It won't happen again." "You're damn right it won't," he seethed. "I'm not firing you this second, only because we are short-staffed for the weekend gala. But consider this your final warning, Vance. You will go back out there. You will find a way to apologize to Mr. Thorne. You will tell him you were mistaken, that you were overwrought, that you don't know what came over you. Then you will finish your shift without speaking another word, unless you are on fire. Do you understand me?" The thought of apologizing to that fraud, of validating his arrogant ignorance, made her feel physically ill. But she saw her tiny, bare apartment in Queens. She saw the stack of final notice bills on her counter. She saw the grim, crushing reality of being unemployed and alone in New York City. "Yes, Antoine." "Good. Now get out and fix your face. You look like a mess." She stepped back into the kitchen's glaring light, her body feeling hollow and numb. Javier gave her a look of pity, but she just shook her head and pushed back through the doors into the dining room. But as she neared Thorne's table, she saw that he was gone. The journalist and his security detail were gone too. The only person remaining was Dr. Alistair Finch, who was slowly folding his napkin, his bill already paid. He had waited. She had been spared the immediate degradation of an apology, but she knew it was a temporary stay of execution. Thorne had left in a rage. She had until the end of the weekend, and then she would be gone. She spent the rest of the night on autopilot, a true ghost. She took orders, cleared plates, poured wine, but her mind was a million miles away, lost in a dusty Boston shop filled with the ghosts of her family. At 2 a.m., her shift was finally over. She changed out of her uniform, the cheap fabric feeling like a straitjacket. She walked out the service entrance into the back alley, the cold, wet November air a welcome shock to her system. And she was not alone. Dr. Alistair Finch was standing under the single, flickering halogen lamp, a rumpled academic owl waiting patiently in the dark. "That was the most astonishing display of applied historical analysis I have ever witnessed in my 50 years in the field," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He wasn't smiling. He was studying her with an intensity that was more unnerving than Thorne's anger. "I'm sorry, sir. I have to go," Elara said, trying to push past him. He blocked her path, not with aggression, but with his sheer, unmovable presence. "I am not an associate of Mr. Thorne's," he said, as if sensing her fear. "I was there as a consultant, a favor to the university to vet a potential donation. A donation I will now be advising them to vehemently refuse." He peered at her over the top of his spectacles. "You spoke of the Moon Jaguar dynasty and a pre-Incan culture called the Sky Weavers. Those are not concepts found in any accepted academic texts. They are considered fringe, the ramblings of a discredited historian from the 1970s, in fact. A man named Vance." Elara froze. "He was my great-grandfather." Dr. Finch's eyes widened slightly. A piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "And Vance antiquarian maps and tomes." My family's, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. He was silent for a long moment, simply observing her, the exhausted waitress huddled in a grimy New York alley. You didn't just correct him, young lady. You presented a cohesive, alternate thesis, complete with material analysis and linguistic context in the space of about 90 seconds. You weren't guessing. You were speaking from a place of absolute certainty. You are not a waitress. I am tonight, she said bitterly, and I'll probably be unemployed by Monday. Perhaps, Dr. Finch said, a strange light glinting in his eyes. Or perhaps not. Julian Thorne has built an empire on a carefully constructed image of being a historical visionary, an image you just publicly shattered. He's not going to let that stand. He will move to discredit you, to destroy you, to paint you as a fraud or a lunatic. He has billions of dollars and a legion of lawyers to do it. Then I'm finished, she said, the last of her fight draining away. Not necessarily, the old professor said, stepping closer. He has money and power. But you, Miss Vance, you have something far more dangerous to a man like him. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the cold air. You have the truth. And I, he added, a hint of a wry smile touching his lips for the first time, have tenure. It makes one remarkably bold. He pulled out a slightly crumpled business card. My office at Columbia University. Be there at 9 a.m. sharp. Bring any and all of your family's research you may have salvaged. We have work to do, and I suggest you get some sleep. You are about to go to war with a dragon, and you will need your strength. The next 2 days were a whirlwind. Ilara called in sick to Ethelgard's, ignoring Antoine's string of furious, threatening texts. For the first time in 6 years, she wasn't Ilara the waitress, the survivor. She was Ilara Vance, the cartographer, and she was preparing her arsenal. She met Dr. Finch not in his office, but deep in the climate-controlled archives of Columbia's rare book library, a subterranean world that smelled of old paper and quiet dignity. It felt more like home than her apartment ever had. From a battered leather satchel, the only thing she'd managed to save from the fire besides her life, she produced her inheritance, her great-grandfather's notebooks, her father's annotated research, and her own half-finished doctoral thesis on a USB drive. For hours they worked. Dr. Finch, with his initial professional caution, cross-examined her, pushing back on her theories, forcing her to defend every assertion. He wasn't being unkind. He was being rigorous. He was treating her not as a waitress, but as a peer. As she laid out the complex grammar of the Sky Weaver's symbols, showed him her father's painstaking chemical analysis of Amazonian pigments, and played audio recordings of her grandfather hypothesizing about the jaguar-sun correlation, she saw the skepticism in Finch's eyes slowly transform into something else. Pure, unadulterated academic excitement. It's a cohesive system, he murmured late that afternoon, staring at a page from her great-grandfather's journal. It's internally consistent. Why was this dismissed? Because he couldn't produce a primary source document, Ilara said quietly. No one had ever found a Skyweaver artifact. It was all theory, linguistic reconstruction, and circumstantial evidence from other cultures' mythologies. The establishment called him a fantasist. Until last night, Finch said, looking at her with newfound respect. Thorne, in his monumental arrogance, may have accidentally provided the Rosetta Stone for your family's entire life's work. But as he spoke, his graduate assistant, a nervous young man named Ben, rushed in, holding a tablet. Dr. Finch, you need to see this. On the screen was the website of the financial magazine the journalist from the dinner worked for. The headline read, Billionaire Julian Thorne uncovers astonishing pre-Columbian map, rewrites American history. The article was a masterpiece of public relations spin. It painted Thorne as a visionary, quoting him extensively. It mentioned the dinner, but twisted the narrative completely. It described a bright, imaginative waitress who, inspired by Thorne's discovery, offered a charming, folkloric interpretation of the map. It quoted Thorne as saying, "It's this kind of raw, untrained passion for history that I aim to inspire. I'm even considering offering the young woman a scholarship to pursue her interests." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. He hadn't just ignored her. He had absorbed her, trivialized her, and turned her into a folksy anecdote in his own heroic story. He was painting himself as her benevolent discoverer. "He's not just trying to discredit you," Finch said, his voice grim as he read the article. "He's trying to own your narrative. He's taking your knowledge and reframing it as his inspiration." "What can we do?" Ilara asked, her voice shaking with rage. "He has a magazine, a PR team. I have a dead man's notebooks." Dr. Finch stood up, his academic stoop seeming to straighten with resolve. "A man like Thorne has one critical vulnerability: his ego. He cannot stand to be seen as ignorant. He has presented himself as the ultimate authority on this map. We are not going to attack his story in the press. We are going to attack his premise. We are going to prove, scientifically and irrefutably, that his interpretation is not just wrong, but impossible." "How?" "He's scheduled a press conference and a private unveiling of the map at the Explorers Club in 2 days, Finch said, tapping on the tablet. "He's invited the world's media and the top academics in the field. He's walking onto the biggest stage imaginable to declare his genius." He looked at Ilara, a glint of battle in his old eyes. "And we are going to be in the front row." "They won't let me in the door, Alistair." "They will let me in," he said. "And you will be my guest, listed as my senior research associate. He won't be able to turn you away without causing a scene." A slow, wolfish grin spread across his face. He thinks he's staging a coronation. In reality, he's staging his own public execution. Now let's get to work. We have less than 48 hours to build a cannon. The Explorers Club was a bastion of old-world masculinity and colonial ambition, its halls filled with taxidermied animal heads, dusty globes, and portraits of stern men with magnificent mustaches. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, brandy, and self-importance. A stage had been set up in the main hall, with the controversial map displayed on a stand in a custom-built, climate-controlled glass case. The room was packed with journalists, academics, and museum curators, all buzzing with anticipation. Julian Thorne stood at the podium, basking in the flash of cameras. He was in his element, a king in his court. Ilara, seated in the front row next to a grimly determined Dr. Finch, felt a wave of nausea. She was wearing her only professional outfit, a simple black dress she'd bought at a thrift store, and felt utterly out of place. Thorne began his speech, a smooth, practiced narrative of his quest to find the map, his voice resonating with false humility and theatrical passion. He described the silence that followed was not empty. It was a physical presence, a dense, heavy element that displaced the air in the grand hall of the Explorers Club. It was the sound of a paradigm shattering. The frantic clicking of camera shutters was a nervous tick in the vacuum, the only proof that time had not, in fact, stopped. Julian Thorne stood on the stage, bathed in the violet glow of the UV lamp, a king suddenly revealed to be made of plaster. The map, his glorious conquest, lay in its glass tomb, no longer a testament to his vision, but a monument to his fraud. His face, a mask of tanned, confident charisma just moments before had collapsed inward, the architecture of his arrogance crumbling into a ruin of slack-jawed fury and abject humiliation. Elara stood before him, the adrenaline that had propelled her to the stage now draining away, leaving a terrifying, hollow calm. She had not raised her voice. She had not needed to. She had simply laid truth upon the table like a clean, sharp blade, and the intricate tapestry of lies Thorn had woven for years had unraveled in an instant. She watched him, not with triumph, but with a strange, clinical detachment. She had expected to feel a surge of vindication, a righteous joy at her family's name being cleared. Instead, she felt a profound and weary sorrow. She had not slain a dragon. She had exposed a man who played with dragon puppets. Dr. Finch was at her side in an instant, his old, frail hand surprisingly firm on her elbow. "Come," he murmured, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "We leave. Now, before the jackals descend." He was right. The initial shock in the room was already curdling into a feeding frenzy. Journalists were surging forward, shouting questions not just at Thorn, but at her. "Miss Vance, how long have you known? Who are you? Is Thorn a fraud?" The words were a meaningless cacophony. Dr. Finch acted as a breakwater, his academic gravitas parting the sea of bodies as he steered her toward a side exit. As they slipped into a quiet, wood-paneled corridor, the roar of the collapsing empire behind them, Elara's legs finally gave way. She sagged against the wall, the scent of lemon polish and old books filling her lungs. The strength that had held her together, the accumulated force of 6 years of silent grief and rage, was gone. She was just a 22-year-old girl in a thrift store dress who had just declared war on a billionaire. "I think I'm going to be sick," she whispered. Finch handed her a handkerchief from his tweed pocket. "Breathe, my dear girl. Breathe. What you did in there, it was more than an academic correction. It was an exorcism." But Elara knew it was also a declaration. Thorn was not a man to accept defeat. He would not slink away. He would retaliate. He would use his fortune not to buy history, but to rewrite this present moment, to erase her, to turn her truth into a lie more fantastic than his own. The battle wasn't over. It had just begun. The first volley came less than 24 hours later. It wasn't a direct assault, but something far more insidious. Thorn's crisis management team, the best money could buy, launched a campaign of strategic obfuscation. A press release was issued, a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. It spoke of new exciting avenues of research opened by the passionate, if unorthodox, theories of a young amateur historian. It praised Thorn's commitment to open discourse and announced a new multi-million-dollar grant, administered by a foundation he controlled, to further investigate the Vance Codex's fascinating potential origins. He wasn't fighting her facts. He was trying to absorb her narrative, to become its patron. He was attempting to pivot from disgraced discoverer to benevolent sponsor. The journalist Sarah called her, her voice a mix of apology and warning. "They're trying to frame you as his discovery, Elara. They're painting him as the magnanimous titan who found a diamond in the rough. His lawyers are also filing a preliminary injunction, claiming the map is his private property, and any further public discussion of it infringes on his rights." The days that followed were a siege. Elara stayed with the Finches in their sprawling, book-filled apartment on the Upper West Side, a sanctuary from the reporters camped outside her building in Queens. Dr. Finch's office at Columbia became their war room. While the academic world buzzed with cautious excitement, Thorn's machine worked to poison the well. Anonymous op-eds appeared, penned by concerned academics, questioning the convenient appearance of a disgruntled former employee with a fantastical family story. They dug into her life, unearthing the fire, the debts, her father's financial struggles, twisting a narrative of tragedy into one of desperate opportunism. For Ilara, the public scrutiny was a special kind of hell. After years of cultivating invisibility, she was now a headline. Her face was on television, her name debated by pundits who mispronounced cartography. The quiet internal world of her knowledge, the sacred space she had shared with her father, was being strip-mined for public consumption. She would wake in the night, the phantom smell of smoke in her nostrils, her father's voice in her ears, not praising her, but warning her. They don't love the knowledge, Ilara. They only love the spectacle. He can't win with facts, so he's attacking your character, Finch said one evening, pushing a thick file across his desk. It was a dossier their university council had compiled on Thorne's legal team. He's going to try and bury us in litigation until you either break or run out of money. He's betting on the latter. I ran out of money 6 years ago, Ilara said, her voice flat. She felt a familiar despair creeping in, the grey, numbing exhaustion she thought she had left behind in the restaurant. What can we do? He has infinite resources. We have your tenure and my great-grandfather's notebooks. We have more than that, Finch said, his eyes glinting behind his spectacles. He thinks the map is the battlefield. He is wrong. The map is a locked door. You, my dear, are the only one with the key. While he is fighting a war in the media, we will open the door. For the next month, they worked. The Vance Codex was moved to a high-security lab at Columbia. Under Finch's protection, Ilara was given full access. The world outside, with its lawyers and talking heads, faded away. Here, in the sterile, climate-controlled silence, she was home. She wasn't a waitress or a viral sensation. She was a scholar, continuing her family's work. She didn't just re-examine what she already knew, she pushed deeper. She cross-referenced the star chart with known astronomical data, pinpointing the exact year the Codex was created by aligning its celestial map with a documented supernova event in 1054 AD, the same event that created the Crab Nebula. The signature flaw her great-grandfather had identified took on new meaning. Using high-resolution digital microscopy, she discovered it wasn't a flaw at all. It was a microglyph, a complex symbol hidden within the larger one, almost invisible to the naked eye. It was a true signature, a personal mark. The breakthrough came late one Tuesday night. She was analyzing the pigment composition with a mass spectrometer, confirming the use of burnt agave, when she noticed a trace anomaly in the red ink used for certain celestial markers. It wasn't cochineal. It was something else, something organic. Under Finch's supervision, they ran a DNA analysis. The results were astonishing. The pigment was mixed with a binding agent containing human DNA. Faint, degraded, but undeniably human. It's a bloodline, she whispered, staring at the screen, the pieces clicking into place with a force that took her breath away. The Serpent Dynasty. It wasn't just a metaphor. This isn't just a record of their lineage. It's a literal part of it. The scribe who made this map mixed their own blood into the ink. This was the canon Dr. Finch had spoken of. It was one thing to challenge an interpretation. It was another to present irrefutable, biological proof of a sacred, ritualistic practice that completely annihilated Thorne's simplistic Viking narrative. It transformed the artifact from a historical curiosity into a sacred object, a vessel of ancestral identity. They didn't release the findings to the press. Instead, Dr. Finch convened a special academic symposium at the university. He invited the world's leading experts in Mesoamerican anthropology, archaeoastronomy, and material analysis. He also, in a stroke of tactical genius, extended a formal invitation to Julian Thorne and his legal team to attend and present any counter-evidence they possessed. Thorne didn't come. To appear would be to legitimize the proceedings, but his absence was an admission of defeat. In a packed auditorium, Elara, flanked by a panel of esteemed professors, laid out her findings. She spoke for 2 hours, not with the fiery defiance of the Explorers Club, but with the quiet, unshakable authority of her expertise. She presented the astronomical alignment, the microscopic signature, and finally, the DNA results. When she finished, there was no applause. There was a long, profound silence, the same silence from the club. But this time, it was not the sound of a myth breaking, but of a new truth dawning. It was the sound of respect. The fallout from the symposium was absolute. Thorne's legal challenges evaporated. His PR narrative collapsed under the weight of scientific fact. The board of his company, which had been wavering, now acted decisively. He was ousted, not just as CEO, but from the board entirely. His name, once a symbol of visionary power, became a punchline in academic circles, a cautionary tale of hubris. The empire didn't just crumble, it was erased, its foundations revealed to be nothing but sand. Months later, Elara stood alone in a different kind of room. It was not a restaurant, a laboratory, or a lecture hall. It was a small, dusty archive in the basement of the Boston Public Library. After accepting the position at the Met, she had taken a leave of absence before starting. There was one last ghost to lay to rest. She had spent weeks sifting through city records, insurance claims, and fire department reports related to the destruction of Vance antiquarian maps and tomes. She found it in a box of her father's old financial records, which had been in a bank's safety deposit box. It was a series of threatening letters from a shell corporation owned by a real estate developer, offering to buy his historic building for a fraction of its worth. The final letter was dated the day before the fire. A quick search revealed the developer had been acquired 2 years prior by a larger holding company. The name of that company was Thorne Industries. He hadn't just stumbled upon her family's legacy. He had paved the way for its destruction. The fire, the one that had taken her father and her life, had not been a random tragedy. It had been a calculated act of corporate violence, a footnote in a property acquisition. Thorne probably never even knew the details, a decision made by some underling to clear a problematic asset. But his greed was the source. His empire was built not just on lies, but on ash, her ash. A cold, hard rage, unlike anything she had ever felt, settled in her bones. For a moment, she wanted to destroy him, to release this information, to see him, not just disgraced, but imprisoned. She could picture the headlines, the trial, the final, satisfying clang of a prison door. But as she sat there in the silence of the archive, the smell of old paper, a comforting balm, she looked at the letter in her hand. It was a story of a greedy, pathetic man. The codex on her desk back in New York was a story of astronomers who mixed their own blood with starlight to map the heavens. She thought of the anonymous scribe, the sky weaver, who had left their mark not for fame, but as a simple declaration. I was here. I saw this. To pursue Thorne now would be to tether her life to his forever. Her story would always be a reaction to his. He would have won in the end by making her world as small and bitter as his own. She folded the letter and placed it back in the file. She would give it to the authorities, quietly, without a press conference. Justice could take its course in the background. It was no longer her story to tell. Her story was in the codex. Her future was not about avenging the past, but about understanding it. A year later, Elara stood under the vast, dark sky of the Atacama Desert in Chile. She had used the advance from her book deal not to buy an apartment, but to fund a field expedition. The Met had enthusiastically agreed. She was here with a small team, following the celestial sightlines predicted by the Vance Codex. They had found it 2 days ago, the ruins of a small stone observatory perched on a cliffside, its main aperture aligned perfectly with the rising point of the Pleiades during the 11th century winter solstice. Tonight, she was alone, having sent her team back to camp. The Codex, a perfect facsimile, was unrolled on a portable table before her. The air was thin and cold, and the stars were not glittering points, but brilliant, burning jewels scattered across black velvet. There was no light pollution, no city glow, only the ancient, silent light of the cosmos. She looked from the map to the sky and back again. The lines and symbols were no longer abstract. Here, under the same sky as its creator, the Codex came alive. It was not just a chart, it was a piece of music, and she could finally hear the melody. The jaguar was not just a symbol, it was the dark nebula in the Milky Way. The serpent was not just a dynasty, it was the sinuous path of a constellation across the ecliptic. She traced the microglyph in the corner, the scribe's secret signature. She thought of him, or her, standing on this very cliff 1,000 years ago, their world as full of politics and passions, grief and hope as her own. They had looked up at this same immutable sky and sought to understand their place within it, to leave a record of their existence in the language of the stars. They had bled for it. Julian Thorne had wanted to own a thing. He had seen a story of conquest, a map from A to B. He had sought to possess the past. But her father, her great-grandfather, and this anonymous scribe from a lost civilization, they had known the truth. You cannot own the past. You can only listen to it. You can't conquer the sky. You can only bear witness to its majesty. A gentle breeze swept down from the Andes, rustling the page. Elara looked up from the map, her gaze settling on the brilliant tapestry overhead. Her family's legacy was secure. Her name was her own. The ghosts were finally quiet. She was no longer reading their footnotes. She was standing on a mountaintop, 1,000 years from home, reading the sky. And she was just beginning to translate.